Hay fever is absolute mofo at the moment. So what I'm going to try and do for you today is tell you like an idiot's guide to shutter speed, frames per second, aperture and ISO. Sort of the four main things as a new sort of camera user perhaps you're sort of not struggling with but getting confused by. I know certainly I still am learning, but I mean I'll give you what I've learned so far. So I'm not going to go into the sort of scientificness around any of these things or even really what they are. I might give a small like rundown on what they are, but generally speaking I'm just going to try and get you up and running with the settings and understanding as soon as possible. So the first things first, what I will try and do when I'm going out to try and film somewhere, the first thing I'll do is try and get my ISO as low as possible. So on the camera I'm using now, which is a G80, I will lower down my ISO to 200. Now if you've got a Canon or various other sort of bigger sensor cameras, you'll be able to go down to 100, crack on. You know, ultimately it's always going to be a compromise unless you've got some kind of amazing setup. And what you'll try and do is try and get the best of all these things, but what I'll tell you is what you want to be aiming for, and then you basically just have to go back from there till you get a picture which is satisfactory. So ISO as low as possible, 100 or 200 depending on your camera. After that you want to go for a frame rate and shutter speed are kind of related. You want to always have your frame rate as close to, your shutter speed as close to double your frame rate as possible. So I tend to shoot in 24 frames a second, just because it has like a satisfying sort of cinematic level of sort of blur and, or not blur, movement in the frame, shall we say, along with like just a pleasant look. It's what sort of American TV shows and films are filmed in. You can get into the sort of PAL debate if you want, but so for YouTube and everything like that, I just go for 24 frames a second. So when you've decided what frames per second you want to use, you want to make sure your shutter speed is as close to double that as possible. Now in some cameras that's not going to be possible to do, like so for example 24 frames a second, the ideal shutter speed would be 48. I don't have that, so I go for 50. As I say, the closest you can get. When I shoot in 60 frames per second, I'll go for 120 frame shutter speed, or I think in fact on this camera it's 125, but you just have to get as close as you can to that. Now the reason for that is basically to allow enough light in, but you also don't get this jitter, particularly with like if you're trying to go for a slow motion kind of look. So with your 60 frames per second footage, if you're trying to slow that down to 24 frames a second, if you do that without having the shutter speed set properly, you're either going to get loads of jitter or it will just look really video and a bit weird, and video is fine, but if you're looking for that cinematic look that people like Peter McKinnon and all these other cool B-roll guys are getting, you want to make sure that your shutter speed and your frames per second are in sync. So you're going to have, if you're doing, I mean they've got better cameras than I have, so they can be doing 120 frames per second, which would mean 240 shutter speed. Literally it works the whole way up. So that one, shutter speed, frames per second, they're both linked. Frames per second is whatever it is, and your shutter speed is double that or as close to as possible. So aperture basically depends what you want to do. If you want to have as much or as big a range in focus as possible, you want to have a higher aperture. If you want to have a little sort of, you know, the nice thing that everyone likes to have where you've got a small plane of focus, if you will, and then everything either side of it nearer to the camera or further away is out of focus, you want to have a lower aperture. This is also going to affect stuff like your ISO and so on and so forth, because if you can't get your aperture, basically the lower your aperture number, the more light is going to come into your camera. So for example, right now I've got two studio lights just away from my face, the other side of the camera. But in order to achieve all my other stuff, so the 24 frames per second, the lowest ISO I can do, I've got an ND filter on my camera here. Now I might do another video about ND filters, but the difference between still photography and video photography is you can control the amount of light coming into your photo by making the shutter speed higher. Now, there are reasons to use an ND filter and stuff for photography. Excuse me, I just kicked the tripod. There are reasons that you would want to use an ND filter in photography, but typically you can just turn the shutter speed up to reduce the amount of light coming in, so your exposure is not ruined. And I suppose really exposure is something else I need to touch on. Now, I use the zebra stripes on this camera, and most digital cameras have got zebra stripes, which is basically going to show you what is overexposed. Now, using that in combination with my ND filter, I tend to find my scene, frame it all up, put the settings as I've just described as lower ISO as possible. I typically will go for quite a low aperture and 24 frames a second in this instance. Now, obviously, if it's a sunny day or there's lots of light or whatever, you're going to struggle to expose that correctly, so that's where you use an ND filter. So typically I'll set that as my settings, 200 ISO, on this lens 3.5 aperture I think it is, 24 frames a second, 50 shutter speed I believe. And then what I'll do is have my ND filter on there, and I turn it around, and basically I see when my scene is overexposed, so there's loads of zebra stripes on it. I'll look at the subject of my scene, so in this case my face, and I'll turn the ND filter until that has got zebras on it, and then I just back it off a little bit so that ideally the subject of what I'm trying to film is going to be exposed correctly. That's kind of it really. And these can be these settings and sort of description can be applied to all manner. It's not specific to this camera. I mean, I have sort of some video apps on my phone where I can change all these settings. The difficulty I have with my phone is that I don't have an ND filter for my phone. I was looking at buying them, but I kind of think £20 for an ND filter for my iPhone, maybe not. I've got ND filters for my Mavic. My Mavic Pro, which are the same. They're not adjustable ones, so I have to like fly up, see what I'm trying to film, see what my settings are, see what my exposure looks like, etc. Come down and change it over to be more appropriate. But the same exact settings can apply. If I'm filming 24 frames a second, I want as close to double that as my frame rate, shutter speed, sorry. And the ISO as low as possible. So, and it's the same across everything. The only place where that really differs is with still photography, where shutter speed can be whatever you want, and you instead of using an ND filter, you'd use shutter speed to control the amount of light getting into there to control exposure. So if you're in a low light situation, you obviously you don't need to use an ND filter because you're trying to get as much light in there as possible, but you might also need to up your ISO. So basically your frames per second, your shutter speed, you don't want to change regardless of the sort of lighting situation. Now you can, in an emergency, make your shutter speed and your frames per second the same, or lower down your shutter speed. Now I would only ever suggest doing that in a really low movement scene, because as soon as you have movement go through there, you're going to get this like ghosty effect, and things are going to start looking weird, which is not what you want. So yeah, certainly you can play with it, but typically shutter speed and aperture and frame rate, you get those set, and then you can adjust. Well, even with the aperture, shutter speed, frame rate are the ones you definitely want to try and get in there nailed down first. Then maybe your aperture, and then maybe your ISO, because ultimately if getting that footage is the main priority, then grain or whatever, or noise in the scene is probably less of a concern, and you can get software to get rid of that to an extent as well, but certainly if you can't see it, it's just black, that's not going to help you very much. So yeah, certainly that's the priorities that I go for. Now I am still learning, as I say, but I mean, I haven't really even got a lot of footage to chop in here and show you the various different bits and bobs, but I'll look to do that in the future. But certainly if you have an opinion on this, or you think I'm massively wrong, I should be prioritising something else, the aperture over the ISO, the shutter speed and frame rate scenario, as I've discussed, is not accurate, then please let me know down in the comment. I'm really, I'm looking to learn. I'm looking to share what I have learned or what I perceive that I've learned. But at the same time, by all means, let me know that I'm saying something wrong and tell me how to do it properly. I'm just looking to make better videos. So the more that you can help me and the more I can help you, the better that is. And that's probably going to be the end for this one. I'll probably do another video about ND filters because I did one before, but it was a bit. So anyway,